So without further ado, I want to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Aneelah Afzali is an attorney and founder and executive director of the American Muslim Empowerment Network, which is a new initiative of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound. Afzali graduated from the University of Oregon Honors College and then Harvard Law School. She currently serves as a board member of the Faith Action Network and is director of legal clinic at the Muslim Community Resource Center. Please welcome Aneelah Afzali.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm so excited and honored to be here. The last time I was at the Linwood Convention Center was for my sister's wedding. So this has a lot of beautiful memories. We had an amazing time. So I'm very happy and excited to be back here. And I'm actually super excited about the fact that we get about 2 hours for this workshop. That is more time than I've ever had to have this topic. Usually, and I talk fast, but usually I'm like motor mouth trying to get in, 1 hour or an hour and a half of content into like 30 minutes or 45 minutes. So I appreciate that I can actually talk a little bit slower. I don't have to have a total motor mouth when I speak with you guys today. So that makes me very happy. So having said that, let me just move these out of my way. I think I have to, do I need to leave this here or, okay. Unless you want to move it. Nope. Okay, I'll move a little bit around, but I'll try to keep this going. Everybody can hear me okay, right? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with me. I know this is right before the weekend and you guys all could be doing a lot of other things rather than talking about such a heavy topic like Islamophobia. But it is a serious one and I'm so honored to have all of you here with me. And thank you to the organizers, the leadership Snohomish County, for inviting me to talk to you about this. As Jennifer said, my name is Aneelah, and because I get a little bit more time than usual, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about my background, telling you a little bit about myself, just so you understand who I am, and you'll get a chance to hear my story, and also I'll talk about a few other stories as well. So let me start with my own background. I am, as you may have heard me speak at other places, I am a proud American Muslim, and I truly am the embodiment of the American dream. Born of proud and hardworking Afghan parents who risked everything to achieve a better future for their children. And like millions of American Muslims across our nation, my family worked extremely hard to be able to provide opportunities for their children to survive and succeed in America. And the hard work of my parents and older siblings paved the way for me to be the first in my family to go to college. Fortunately, not the last. And then my aspirations didn't end there. I continued on, as Jennifer mentioned, to Harvard Law School, then worked at 2 law firms, making partner at one, and then became general counsel of a healthcare IT company in Bellevue. And in terms of faith, I was born and raised Muslim. And I was taught Islamic values like the importance of education, which is why I was inspired to pursue my own education for so far. And my mom was a devout, practicing Muslim, but my dad was not. He was what we call a Ramadan Muslim, which is during the month of Ramadan. You guys know that maybe as like Easter Christians or some other similarities, right? So during the month of Ramadan, which is actually coming up in about a month now, but during that month, my family, we all practiced. We all prayed, we all fasted, but outside of then, my dad didn't really practice. My mom still did, but my dad did not. And I think we as children tend to follow the easier path, whatever it may be, so we tended to gravitate towards my dad's path and not sort of really practice Islam outside of the holy month of Ramadan. But I personally chose Islam as my own faith after studying it in high school and then specifically taking a comparative religions course in college and really analyzing it there. And we can talk in the Q&A, which we actually will have time for a lot of Q&A, which is wonderful. But it wasn't, till college when I chose Islam on my own, and we can talk about why I chose it for myself. But while I chose Islam with my mind at that time in college, it hadn't really penetrated my heart. It hadn't really moved me. And, I continued on through college and then law school and my legal career. And, every day I was taking a step further and further away from the faith teaching, sort of some of the things that I was doing in my own life. Some things that I can now recognize as even destructive behavior, but the legal field and some others pushed me towards a certain direction, and I took that direction. But what I had done even during all that time was reserve my worship mostly, again, for the month of Ramadan. And outside of that, I would party, I would club, I would do, all the other stuff that I was doing. And I often thank God for what I was given. I recognize that I'm, grateful. I was grateful for what I had, but I didn't really act on sort of what I believe was the true path for myself, or the truth for myself. And my actions slowly took me away and away further from the path that I was taught through my faith, especially as I climbed the corporate ladder. But I reached a point where that reality of my ingratitude, not in words, because like I said, I thank God a lot, but in my actions, including my negligence of not even having read the Quran cover to cover. Because what I would do is every Ramadan, I would start from the beginning, read the Quran, never get through it, make it maybe halfway through, and then stop and close the book until next Ramadan, where I would start all over again. So one Ramadan, after I had this realization, this recognition of my ingratitude, I actually took the time to read the Quran cover to cover. And that's when it shook me to the core. And it really moved me. That's when I had this spiritual transformation. And I actually left my legal career at that point. I took a break from my legal career, and I realized, you know what? I need to spend some time actually studying this. So I pursued two things that my faith teaches: knowledge and service. And that's what I did. For the past 3 years, that's what I've been doing, learning more and more about Islam and doing what I can to serve humanity, to serve my community, to serve sort of people in need. That has been what I've been doing the past 3 years. So that forced a real transformation in my life. I also did a Quran intensive course and studied a lot of other things as well in order to really understand Islam and its teachings. And this happened at such an opportune time, because if you look around what was happening in our country, with the increasing divisiveness, with the rise in Islamophobia, all of this was happening at the same time. So I believe in divine guidance. I believe that this was sort of my path that I was led to, and it just all happened to fall into place exactly at the time that it needed to fall into place. But then I reached a crossroads at the end of last year, and that was because I couldn't continue working for free. For 3 years, not having a job was not sustainable. So I reached a crossroads, and I thought about, do I have to go back into the legal world? And I started interviewing and looking at some places. And that's when the leadership of my mosque, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, they actually approached me, because they had seen me engaged and involved in a lot of these interfaith outreach efforts and talking and teaching people about Islam. So they approached me and they said, what are your plans? What are you thinking of doing? And I said, well, actually, you happened to catch me right at the time that I'm at this crossroads and I'm trying to decide sort of which direction I should go in my life. And I gave them this idea that I had for AMEN, American Muslim Empowerment Network. And the reason I had this idea is I recognized that our community, the American Muslim community, was being demonized, was being vilified. All this information was being spread, false information and conspiracy theories were being spread against Muslims and Islam in our country. So I realized all that, and I had this idea for addressing that, trying to be proactive in addressing that. So I shared this idea of AMEN with my mosque leadership, and they said, we love it, but do it through MAPS. And that's how we launched MAPS AMEN at the end of last year. So that's the context there. And I personally have found so much beauty and peace in Islam, as I'm sure my Christian and Jewish and other friends have found in their faith traditions. And my own conduct and character, I have to say, has significantly improved with the Islam, with the transformation that I personally had in my own journey of faith. And Muslims around the world are inspired by their faith daily to give back to their communities in terms of philanthropy, in terms of volunteer service. This is something that we see happening around the world. And I've also witnessed the transformation and the experience, that transformation of Islam, the impact it had on my own family members, including especially my younger brother and my father. My younger brother, who had been an atheist for most of his adult life. And to see him after I sort of had my transformation and I had opportunities to speak with him about faith, to watch the transformation in him has been tremendous. Like, it is just so awe-inspiring. People who know him before and after, before sort of in the previous days and know him now are just profoundly blown away by how much transformation he's had in a positive sense, including most specifically something that I recognize because I've always been a strong feminist, was including in his treatment and approach and attitude towards women. That has changed significantly with his transformation. So it has been a beautiful process for me to get to experience that in my own family members. Now, I don't say any of this, for that matter, in order to proselytize. That's not at all my intention. But rather to help explain the impact of Islam in my own life, and my own family's life, and why I'm so troubled by what I see around us in terms of the vitriolic anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Islam viewpoints that we see around us every single day and that are spread constantly in our country. And also to show that, yes, I have lived the experience of Islam pretty much my whole life, even when I wasn't practicing. For people who challenge me, which I have had people who challenge me, even though some other people are not Muslim and they use Google as their source of information, I have literally been challenged. When I've presented about what Islam teaches, I've had somebody in one instance in particular that I remember, after giving this long talk about Islam and stats and data and information and everything, this gentleman stood up and he just literally said, "I don't believe anything you said, simply because I'm Muslim." So this is the context, this is what we're dealing with. And I personally myself have experienced Islamophobia in my daily life and how people treat me, and having people, even on places like Alki, as I walk down the beach, having people roll down their windows and scream all kinds of profanities at me and obscenities. I've had this, I've personally experienced this. But in any case, I share that background for you to recognize sort of where I'm coming from in all of this. And in this workshop, in this time that we have together, I will be talking about Islamophobia, what it is, how it manifests itself, and most importantly, what each of you in this room can do to combat Islamophobia. So let's start with what is Islamophobia. And I like the definition from Georgetown Bridges Initiative, this new initiative that they launched there to combat Islamophobia. And they define it as Islamophobia is prejudice towards or discrimination against Muslims due to their religion or perceived religious, national, or ethnic identity associated with Islam. Like anti-Semitism, racism, and homophobia, Islamophobia describes mentalities and actions that demean an entire class of people. Jews, African Americans, and other populations throughout history have faced prejudice and discrimination. Islamophobia is simply another reincarnation of this unfortunate trend of bigotry. And I like that definition because it really puts things in context. Because Islamophobia is not necessarily something new, right? It is a continuation of the narrative that we have had throughout our country against different minority communities, marginalized communities, whether it's the African American community, whether it's the Jewish American community, whether it's the Japanese American community, other communities and so many others have had this as well. So this is just the same script with different players, different labels, but the same thing is happening behind that. And one important note, that rational criticism of Islam or Muslims based on factual evidence is not Islamophobia. Just like criticism of tenets of or followers of other religious practices or ethnic groups does not necessarily indicate bigotry or prejudice. It's the refusal to listen to facts and data or statistics. It's the refusal to change your mind about something, to be so hard set on some negative perspective that no matter how much the data may say otherwise, you refuse to believe that. Or applying double standards to Islam when you would never apply those same standards to other faith traditions. That's the context in which Islamophobia arises. So let's be clear about that. Let's start with what's happening. What are we seeing in our country? And I'm going to start with some stories that I wish were not true. So in Michigan, a masked gunman entered a store with a rifle. He pointed it at the 34-year-old store clerk who went by Tony. He demanded money from Tony, and Tony handed over a bag of cash. But the gunman didn't stop there. He forced Tony into the back room, had him get down on his knees, put the barrel of his gun in Tony's mouth, and then started yelling all kinds of anti-Muslim slurs at him, calling him a terrorist, a member of ISIS, saying things like, "I used to kill people like you in Iraq with no problem." Now, Tony actually thought that he was going to be killed with the gun in his mouth. So he struggled against this gunman, and he managed to move the barrel of the gun just a little bit over, right as the man pulled the trigger. That action of moving it over saved his life because the bullet went through his cheek instead of the back of his head. So fortunately, Tony did recover from that after being in the hospital for a while. And that's what saved his life, fortunately. In Missouri, a 15-year-old kid was just getting into a car in front of a mosque when he was deliberately hit by an SUV. His legs were severed, leading to enormous blood loss. He was taken to the hospital, but unfortunately, he didn't survive. The man who killed him had a history of harassing the local Muslim community and making violent threats to them. And he had anti-Muslim material all over the car that he used, the SUV that he used as a weapon to kill this young 15-year-old kid. In an article denouncing ignorance in action, Daniel Burke wrote, "Muslims have been shot and killed execution style in their living rooms and outside of their mosques. They have been fatally stabbed on their way home. They have been beaten in their stores, in their schools, and on the streets. They have been kicked off airplanes, egged outside Walmart, scorched with hot coffee in a park, shot in cabs, and punched while pushing their children in strollers. Their clothes have been set on fire, and their children have been bullied. Men have come to their door and told them that they would burn down their house if they did not move away. They have been fired for wearing hijabs and for praying. They have seen their cemeteries vandalized and their Quran desecrated. A Muslim congressman has received death threats, and business owners have posted signs advertising Muslim-free zones. Heavily armed men have protested outside mosques in Texas and Arizona, arguing that it's their patriotic duty to protect the country from Islam," end quote. And this is real. My friends and people I personally know have been attacked. About a year ago here in Everett, nearby, a 19-year-old American Muslim girl who had converted to Islam and wore a head covering like me, somebody I know, she was beaten by a grown man who yelled the same anti-Muslim slurs and conspiracy theories that we often hear on mainstream media while this man was viciously attacking her. She went home to her family with a bloody cheek, bruised ribs, and suffered a concussion and damage to her head. And she still hasn't fully recovered to this day. And this happened in daylight, too. At the UW Seattle campus, we had a young Muslim woman, a student there who wears hijab, also get hit in the face with a glass bottle. And she also suffered a concussion. And my own mosque, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, was vandalized twice. Our sign, was vandalized twice in less than a month. Now, I could go on and spend the whole 2 hours just talking about these kinds of stories. But the point is that these examples are not isolated incidents. They're part of a growing and very disturbing trend of hate crimes happening across our nation against Muslims and those perceived as Muslim. In fact, Tony from my first story with the barrel of the gun in his mouth, he wasn't even Muslim. And during most of the hate crimes that we've seen, attackers use the same anti-Muslim slurs that are heard and reported daily on mainstream media and headlines and often repeated by commentators and politicians alike. Now, the most devastating aspect of all of this to me and to many other people is the impact on kids, on children. Young Muslim students are being made fun of and bullied in their schools, even by their own teachers and school administrators sometimes. There's no actual statistical data on this, but according to community surveys, 8 out of 10 young Muslim kids are bullied or face bullying and discrimination and attacks in their schools, and often, again, in front of their teachers or school administrators. And then, of course, we have talk of registries, surveillance, and the executive orders banning travel on people from Muslim-majority countries, with a significant impact on all American Muslims. Fortunately, that was stopped, at least for now, by the rule of law and our wonderful system of checks and balances in our country. So go Washington and Attorney General Bob Ferguson for that. But that gives you a sense of what's happening. So then the question is, why is this happening, right? Why is all of this, why do we see this significant increase in hate crimes against Muslims or those perceived as Muslims? Many people point to Donald Trump. And we certainly have seen, a Donald Trump effect, where demonizing Muslims, along with many other groups, is made mainstream and acceptable. And in fact, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of anti-Muslim hate groups has increased 3 times since the elections. Since the beginning of 2016. But it's not just Donald Trump, and it's not a new problem. This trend of Islamophobia preceded Donald Trump and goes well beyond him. In fact, 2015 was the year of the highest level of reported hate crimes against Muslims or those perceived as Muslims in our nation's history to date. And that was a 67% increase from 2014. That was the biggest increase against any group. The increase against hate crimes against Muslims was greater than the increase against any other group in our country. And that is likely even an underestimation because a lot of hate crimes go unreported. So there's that aspect, that it goes well beyond and preceded Donald Trump. Other people point to specific acts of violence, like 9/11, as the cause of all this anti-Muslim violence or hate or Islamophobia. Now, without going into the role of our foreign policies in creating or supporting certain violent groups around the world, there's no doubt that there are evil people and groups, evil groups, including some who call themselves Muslims, who have done horrible things and want to do horrible things. I'm not here to justify or excuse that in any way. I and Muslims around the world emphatically, categorically, repeatedly, consistently have condemned such violence and ideology of these kinds of deviant criminals and cults. And Muslims, in fact, have been the biggest victims of these kinds of evil criminals and cults. But you know what's interesting? Research shows that it's not really the specific acts of violence that lead to hate crimes against others that may have something in common with the perpetrators of that act of violence. Rather, according to research, it's the media coverage and how commentators and politicians speak about the incidents that lead to the hate crimes. And we know that there has been a constant and consistent demonizing of Muslims and Islam through the media, through Hollywood, through pop culture, reality shows. Almost daily, there are articles or shows on TV and radio promoting conspiracy theories or associating Islam with negative behavior. And research shows that it's this kind of media coverage that directly affects people's perceptions and fuels hate and prejudice against minority groups. In fact, according to data from Media Tenor, which has looked into analyzing news coverage over the course of several years and even decades, Islam is the most often mentioned religion in mainstream media, and 80% of that coverage or more is negative and even defamatory. Just to put things in perspective, 73% of the coverage of North Korea is negative, even though North Korea is officially on our nation's list of state sponsors of terrorism. To put it more in perspective, in a study of the New York Times alone, which is considered by many as a liberal newspaper, in the course of 25 years, the New York Times portrayed Islam and Muslims more negatively than cancer and cocaine. Just to put it in perspective for you. That's what we're talking about. And the local chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, did a study of the Seattle Times as well and found similar double standards and misinformation being spread there in terms of the portrayal of Islam and Muslims. So media coverage and portrayal of Muslims and Islam has and continues to play the biggest role in fueling anti-Muslim sentiment, fear or hate of Muslims. Now, there are two main issues here. One, is the coverage accurate? Because if it's accurate, if that's how Muslims are, then hey, that's appropriate. That kind of media coverage would be appropriate. And there would be nothing wrong with the media presenting reality. The second is there consistency? Or do we see any kind of media bias or double standards? Well, first off, as you can probably guess, the coverage is not accurate. What you'll find is that almost all the actual evidence we have from reputable sources go against what is presented in the media or by politicians. According to actual statistics, we have faced a far greater security threat in our country from white supremacists, right-wing extremists, and ultra-national separatist groups. But that's not what we see in the media. According to the FBI, 94% of terror attacks on American soil between 1980 and 2005 were committed by non-Muslims. And I cite that statistic, that data, because that's the most long-term data that the FBI had. Non-Muslims made up the overwhelming majority of terrorists in Europe as well. Every year between 2004 and 2014, 97% to 100% of the attacks there in the EU were committed by non-Muslims. A study by the University of North Carolina found that from 9/11 to the end of 2013, less than 0.0002% of Americans killed in terrorist attacks were killed by Muslims. And that the average American, therefore, is far more likely to be crushed to death by their couch or television, or killed by a toddler, or struck by lightning, than they are to be killed by a Muslim. That same study found that attacks by Muslims accounted for 50 total fatalities from 9/11 to 2013, while right-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks per year since 9/11, causing a total of 254 fatalities. So 5 times higher for right-wing domestic terrorists. And you might say, well, what about ISIS? And I say, yes, Muslims, in fact, are the biggest victims of ISIS. The bottom line is that violence and terror has no unique religion. Dylan Roof and Timothy McVeigh, the KKK, Westboro Baptist Church, Lord's Resistance Army, and countless other examples of violence by those who self-identify as Christian. We have Jewish fundamentalists like Baruch Goldstein, who was responsible for the Hebron massacre. We have Buddhist monks, yes, monks, in Burma or Myanmar, killing and persecuting Muslims right now. We have Hindu groups too, like the Rebel Tigers in Sri Lanka or Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who are actually one of the most organized terrorist groups in the world. They invented the suicide vest and are the only terrorist group to have assassinated 2 world leaders. And there are many secular groups who have engaged in such violence as well. The fact of the matter is that evil, violent people, unfortunately, exist in all religions and among the non-religious as well. History proves that to us. And in fact, according to Gallup polls, compared to American Christians, Mormons, Jews, and atheists, American Muslims are the strongest opponents of attacks on civilians. Compared to 38% of Protestants, 39% of Catholics, 43% of Jews, 33% of Mormons, and 56% of atheists who said that attacks on civilians are never justified, a whopping 78% of American Muslims say that attacks on civilians are never justified. And if we're going to grossly generalize and label all Muslims by the actions of a few, it would be far more appropriate to label all Muslims as Peace Prize winners, because 5 out of the past 12 individual Nobel Peace Prize winners have been Muslim, including Muslim women. So the perception of Muslims and Islam as somehow more violent is extremely wrong and misleading, and leads to the dangerous hate crimes I mentioned before. Second, the media coverage is in fact biased. We have double standards in media coverage, so that a criminal's religion comes into focus if they're Muslim. But when others engage in violent actions, they're often described as lone wolves with mental problems, like Dylan Roof, the white supremacist who went into a church and killed 9 African Americans. He was not officially labeled a terrorist. Robert Deere, the Christian warrior, self-described Christian warrior, who killed 3 people, including a police officer, and injured 9 others, including 5 police officers at a Planned Parenthood clinic. He wasn't labeled a terrorist. Any of you heard of Robert Doggart? Okay, a couple people. Maybe you guys have been to some of my sessions. I know, Tammy, you have. So Robert Doggart, see, the majority of people in this room, overwhelmingly, pretty much everyone except maybe 2 people, nobody has heard of him. He was an ordained Christian minister and a candidate for Congress. He was plotting to attack a Muslim community in New York after watching Fox News and believing that Muslims were out to get him and that they were a threat. Doggart was arrested by the FBI a day before his planned attack. He was a member of several private militia groups who claimed he had 9 committed members with him ready to engage in this attack. And he even detailed the weapons that he would use, including military assault weapons, explosives, armor-piercing ammunition, and a machete to then cut Muslims to bits. He also expressed his willingness to die in the terror attack, wanting to prove his commitment to God, to his Christian God. He was not charged with any terrorism-related crimes. And he entered into a plea agreement, pleading guilty to 1 count of making threats via telephone. But guess what? A federal judge rejected that plea, questioning whether he was really a true threat under the law. What do you think would have happened if Robert Doggart had been Muslim and had planned to attack Christians in this way? No doubt he would have been charged with terrorism-related crimes, and I'm sure you'd agree we'd see wall-to-wall media coverage all day. Doggart was convicted on February 12th, 2017, this year, and still hardly any media coverage. A Google News search of Robert Doggart within 24 hours of the first day of his trial came back with only 1 story from a local Tennessee media outlet, with just a simple article that was titled, "Tennessee Man with Plans to Attack a Muslim Community Appears in Court." No labels, nothing else, no affiliation with his religion, that's it. And you know what else is so grossly perverse? Is the very same day that Doggart's trial began, Donald Trump said in a speech that the dishonest media didn't cover radical Islamic terrorism. Doggart is not the only criminal plotting to kill American Muslims. There are others who want to kill me, my family, my friends, and others just on account of our faith. Like, how many of you have heard of Glendon Scott Crawford? Can you raise your hand? Nobody. The whole room, not one person raised their hand. So who is he? He's a terrorist who was acquiring a radiation weapon of mass destruction that was described as a remote-controlled radiation device called Hiroshima on a light switch. And his plan was to kill Muslims, and also President Obama at the time. The US attorney told the jurors in that case that Crawford's plans were very real, very viable, and very deadly. He was convicted and sentenced in December 2016, and not one person in this room has heard of him. Again, imagine if that was a Muslim. How many of you have heard of the Bureau of American Islamic Relations, or BEAR? Raise your hand. A couple people, okay. So BEAR is a play on CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and they're an extremist group in Texas, literally training as a militia against a non-existent Islamic threat by dipping their bullets in pig's blood and bacon grease to target Muslims. They staged an armed protest at a Texas mosque earlier this month, and they actually posted the names and addresses of Muslims and Muslim sympathizers on their Facebook page. Again, imagine if there was a Muslim militia in our country preparing to kill Christians. These are not the only ones. There are other armed militia groups in our country as well, like the 3% security force in Georgia that have protested at mosques, prevented the construction of mosques, and intimidate women and children and others from exercising their right to religious freedom in our country. And of course, we've seen deadly attacks at mosques as well, including in Quebec City, where the right-wing terrorists murdered 6 Muslims and wounded many others. Now, we don't hold an entire religion or a religious group responsible for the acts of such individuals, nor should we. It doesn't make any sense. But there is a double standard with Muslims. When a person self-identifies as Christian and commits terrorism, the media almost always distances the group from that person, describing them again as mentally unstable, as lone wolves, including in headlines. One of the best examples of this is just crazy, but this is one of the best examples. A Washington Times media headline that was reporting on a study that came out of Duke and University of North Carolina, and that study that it was reporting on found that the majority of fatalities in terms of domestic terrorism were at the hands of white supremacists. This is what the study found, and that it was not Muslims, it was at the hands of white supremacists. This is what the study found. This Washington Times media outlet was reporting on this study, and you know what their headline was? It was, "Majority of fatal attacks on US soil carried out by white supremacists and not terrorists." By definition, you have excluded, white supremacists from the category of terrorists. This is what we're seeing. And with Muslims, people will do anything and everything to emphasize the religious identity of these bad actors, even when those bad actors themselves are not practicing Muslims. And at the same time, seeking to strip the religious identity of others who are practicing Muslims, like Muhammad Ali, peace be upon him. When he passed away, there were people really trying to show that he was not a Muslim, when in fact he prayed 5 times a day and he spoke about his religious faith all the time and tried to practice and live his faith in his life every single day. And then more importantly, we as everyday people, as lay people, are able to differentiate that one violent criminal person from the religion and the rest of the people of that group. Because we know enough about Christianity and Christians to not fear Christianity or all Christians who look or act or think like that person in terms of some commonality. Now imagine if all we heard about Christianity were the Dylan Roofs, the Glendon Scott Crawfords, and Robert Doggerts of the world. And then imagine if we coupled that with certain violent verses taken out of context from the Bible. Now, I won't even go to the Old Testament. I could give you many examples there. I think you know. Let's go with the New Testament. Imagine if all you kept hearing repeatedly was Luke 19:27, where Jesus is quoted as saying, "But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me." Imagine if that's all you heard about Christianity. Repeatedly, every single day you heard this. That's the situation of what's happening with Muslims and Islam. Now, just to be clear, I recognize, and I think all of you do too, that Jesus did not preach killing anybody. I'm very clear on that, peace be upon him. But I just want to point out that things taken out of context can lead to this kind of misinformation. And because of what's happening in this way, I don't blame everyday Americans who watch mainstream media and fear Muslims and Islam and lump all Muslims together in this way, because they're being manipulated and brainwashed into thinking this way. And you know what? There is a well-funded infrastructure behind all of this that promotes and profits off of this campaign of misinformation and manipulation. These anti-Muslim hate groups have spent over $200 million to demonize Islam and Muslims for well over a decade, using hate speech and promoting conspiracy theories against Muslims. And I'm so sad because I forgot my posters. I actually have these huge posters that show you the whole Islamophobia network and the players and the money sources and everything. But you can find that. I think in the material you got some, you have a combating Islamophobia action sheet in your material. Did you get that? No? Okay, then I have some here. But you'll find the information for where you can learn about that whole network. I'll be sure to share that action sheet with you. But bottom line is that when hate speech and conspiracy theories against a minority are constantly spread in the media and they go unchallenged and are even promoted by politicians and commentators, they foster the atmosphere that we have today with hate crimes, like the ones I mentioned earlier. What's scary is that some of the worst anti-Muslim bigots are now talking to or in the Trump administration, even serving in some senior roles, like Frank Gaffney or Sebastian Gorka. And then we have others like Bridget Gabriel, who recently visited the White House, who have access to the administration. Now, Bridget Gabriel is the founder of Act for America, which is labeled a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the worst ones, and they have local chapters, including here. And I work with Pastor Terry Kylo, and he had an event where members of Act for America who were paid to show up, they showed up at one of our local events, and they would not even allow the Muslim speakers to speak and share the truth about what's happening. To the point that Pastor Terry Kylo had to just close it out by just singing, "We Shall Overcome," because it got so bad. This is locally happening here in our greater Seattle area. And because of the misinformation and negative portrayal of Muslims and Islam in the media, it's important for all of you to recognize and know some facts versus fiction, like the fact that Muslims are not new to America. There's this impression created, this perception created right now, but the reality is that Muslims have been part of our country since before we were an independent nation, with up to 30% of the slaves who were brought over from Africa being Muslim. Muslims fought in our Revolutionary War, our Civil War, World War I, World War II, and every single war since to defend our nation. Hundreds of thousands of American Muslims are on the front lines today, serving as members of military, law enforcement, firefighters, doctors, first responders, all of that. And over 10,000 American Muslims serve in our nation's military, and many have even made the ultimate sacrifice of their lives for our country, including Captain Humayun Khan, whose story you may have heard of from Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail. Captain Humayun Khan's father, Khizr Khan, who was the Gold Star parent who spoke at the convention and raised the Constitution, waving it at not President Trump at that time, but candidate Trump. Oh no, it wasn't candidate Trump. Yeah. So he actually is coming here to town. If any of you want to hear him speak, he's going to be here May 7th at the CARE Washington, the Council on American Islamic Relations, at the banquet that's happening on May 7th. So you're all invited to get a ticket for that and join us for that. But he'll be here. So we have examples of Muslims who have given up their lives for this, like his son. And over 50,000 American Muslims are doctors saving lives every single day, like my younger sister, who works at Harborview and UW Medical Center. That's 1 in 18 medical doctors across America being Muslim, when Muslims are about 1% of the population. So that's significant. So you have a significantly greater chance of being saved by a Muslim than hurt by one. And we know that Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran, and he actually explicitly mentioned Muslims in defining the parameters of religious freedom in our country back at the founding fathers' time. And the US Supreme Court in 1935, in fact, honored Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as one of the 18 greatest lawgivers in our country, in our nation's, in the world's history. And I went to Harvard Law School, and there is a quote from the Quran at the Harvard Law Faculty Library at the entrance there. One of the greatest manifestations of justice in world history is from the Quran. That's recognized there, among others. The reality is that American Muslims are and have been part of our country and are part of the diversity that makes our country great. And inspired by our faith, American Muslims give back to society, just as Islam teaches. And American Muslims share the same American values and freedoms that we all cherish, knowing that we're all in this together. American Muslims also deserve the same opportunities as all Americans to build better futures for our families and children. And American Muslims believe in the right and freedom of all US citizens to live and worship in their own way, and they deserve to practice their faith in return. Now, Islamophobia ignores all of this and lumps all Muslims based on the very tiny minority who engage in violent, horrible criminal activities. And because of this broad brush, everyday American Muslim children and their families are being threatened, harassed, attacked, and even killed in our country. So why should you care about Islamophobia? I mean, it's like Muslims are the target. Why should you care if you're not a Muslim? First off, millions of Americans, our fellow Americans, are being manipulated and brainwashed with respect to reality and facts versus fiction and fear-mongering when it comes to Muslims and Islam. Islamophobia affects every American who cares about freedom and democracy, not just Muslims, because it attacks our shared American values, our legacy of religious freedom and tolerance, and our unity and diversity. So it's not just the right thing to do to combat Islamophobia, but it's in fact the American, patriotic thing to do, to stand against such manipulation, bigotry, discrimination, and hatred, and in support of the ideals of our country. Beyond that, beyond it just being the right thing to do and the American thing to do, Islamophobia makes all of us less safe because it takes resources away from the actual criminals, like the Robert Deers and Robert Doggerts. Sorry if your name is Robert. I don't mean to imply that it's all Robert. Let's just be clear there. I'm not implying anything. But Islamophobia also makes us less safe by providing recruiting material for the deviant criminals and cults. In fact, anti-Muslim hate groups and those deviant cult groups like ISIS, they actually share a view about what Islam teaches, which is not what the rest of the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world believe. But those two extremes, they're united in their viewpoints. They share similar viewpoints. And it's dangerous when you feed that kind of viewpoint. And don't take my word for it. Former CIA Director David Petraeus, he expressed his concern about the increasing anti-Muslim rhetoric in a Washington Post op-ed, where he described these kinds of policies and rhetoric as totally counterproductive and making our country less safe. And you know what else? Islamophobia opens the door to other forms of bigotry. In fact, and this is surprising, the strongest predictor of anti-Muslim sentiment is not age or race or background or anything else, it's anti-Semitism. A person who is anti-Jewish is 32 times as likely to also have anti-Muslim views. And there are also links to other types of bigotry, whether anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-immigrant. If we don't want hatred and bigotry against any group, then we need to stand up and stop it when it happens against any minority in our country. Because bigotry and discrimination, they're like a fire. And if we have a fire in our house in one room, it's not going to stay in that one room. It is going to spread and bring the whole house down. You can't just say, oh, it's that room, it's not my room, right? And this is why you see non-Muslims also facing attack, like Tony from my first story, or the Indian American who was killed in Kansas earlier this year, or the Sikh man who was attacked in Kent last month. We also had a Hindu man shoved in front of an oncoming subway train in New York City where he died. A Catholic American man who was originally from Trinidad who was shot in the face next to a Walmart in Florida. And the person who shot him actually asked him whether he was from the Middle East. And then he fired a pellet gun at him. And he later told the police that he didn't care that his victim wasn't Muslim, saying they are all the same. That sentiment, otherizing groups and putting everybody together, can be something that can affect all of us in this room. So we Muslims are like the canaries in the coal mine. While we may be among the ones immediately affected by Islamophobia, what's happening with Islamophobia hurts all of us as Americans, and it promotes bigotry and discrimination against other groups as well. And that fire of hate and bigotry could destroy the greatness of our country. Another reason you should care is that Islamophobia is driven by fear. And research shows that fear makes us more accepting of authoritarianism and more willing to give up our liberties and freedoms in the name of security. This threatens all of us as Americans and our freedoms. And if we don't want to be manipulated by fear to give up our freedoms and liberties, then we need to speak out against Islamophobia. And then besides the domestic problems here in America, Islamophobia leads to horrible foreign policy decisions as well. It's a lot easier to engage in military action, in drone attacks, or to drop the mother of all bombs when we don't know Muslims or understand Islam. And that hurts all of us too, because again, it takes resources away from domestic work that we could be doing here to improve our country. And you know what? I understand if people are scared of being attacked. That's a fear we all have. But Muslims are in fact the biggest victims of such attacks around the world, and we have the double whammy of also having to deal with the attacks because of Islamophobia. And I have to say, just perception and recognition of something, that who is really the terrorist when Muslims around our country are literally being terrorized by these anti-Muslim bigots with guns oftentimes at our mosques, on social media, I can't even read comments anymore, and elsewhere. Earlier this month, we had people show up at my mosque in protest. And they had signs, big signs, and they were shouting at our congregation members, "You are not worthy, Jesus said so." That's what they were shouting and protesting. Now, my Christian friends were quick to reassure me that that is not what Jesus said, because Jesus came before Muhammad and he would never say something like that. And I reassured them they do not have to tell me that, because I already know that. And also because we Muslims, we believe in Jesus. We revere Jesus. We recognize his beautiful teachings, accept those beautiful teachings, right? We accept those as part of our faith tradition as well. And the other thing that these people who sort of antagonize mosques or protest mosques, one thing they don't recognize is what we do at the mosque. It's more than just a place of worship. Like my mosque alone, we offer a free medical clinic, monthly medical clinic for the whole community, not just Muslims, a free legal clinic, including one this Sunday, including feeding the homeless, caring for highways and parks, so many interfaith events. We have open houses all the time, including Saturday, tomorrow. You're all welcome to join us for that as well. We have a children's school. We have a beauty salon. We have a clothing store. We have a cafe and a restaurant. We have so much at MAPS. And people don't recognize all of this. This is, a mosque is a community center, and it's not just for Muslims' benefit. It's for the whole community to benefit from that. So when people attack or protest our mosque, or when they attack our sign, as they did twice in less than a month, they're actually attacking our entire community. And this is why we had an outpouring of communal support in response to those attacks, because the community recognizes the positivity that we contribute there. And we recognize these kinds of attacks as an attack on our shared American values. And I also have to ask, who's scarier? Me at my whole 5'3.5" on a good day, or the burly man who was over 6'3" and he got scared of little old me at the library because of this? Think about that. This is why Islamophobia is irrational. It makes us scared and less safe and less free as a result. And we all should care about that. So how do we combat Islamophobia? Recognizing that this is a problem, recognizing that it impacts all of us, what do we do in response? Well, I actually have a whole action sheet and resource list. On ways that you could take action to combat Islamophobia. But some of the things I'll highlight from that. The first and foremost important thing is to learn about Islam and Muslims. Muslims are nearly 1/4 of the world's population, and Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and it's the fastest growing, one of the fastest growing religions in the world. But 60% of our fellow Americans don't personally know a Muslim. And 80% of our fellow Americans say they know little or nothing about Islam. So learn about Islam, meet Muslims, visit a mosque. I mentioned the open house. We're having one tomorrow. Every single one of you are invited to MAPS in Redmond. Starts at 10:30. There'll be a mosque tour, observance of prayer, a presentation on Islam 101, a Q&A session, and a free lunch. And our food is usually pretty good. So you're all invited, and we welcome you to join us. Get to know your Muslim neighbors. And then check out websites like islamfactcheck.org or the frequently asked questions on the ING website to help learn the truth about Islam instead of the misinformation. And when you build these kinds of personal connections, you see the power of humanity and unity at play. And we have seen this. Do any of you know Ted Hakey Jr.? Okay, so he's a guy who lived next door to a mosque, but he never went into that mosque. Instead, he had very strong anti-Muslim viewpoints, promoted attacking Muslims on his social media, and one day he decided himself to act on what he was, I guess, preaching. He took his gun, his rifle, assault rifle, and shot into his neighboring mosque. Fortunately, it was like at 2 a.m. or something. Nobody was there. Nobody got hurt. He did get charged. And fortunately, he went to the mosque. The mosque invited him, and he went to them. And he actually apologized. And you know what he said after meeting them? He explained how he had never knocked on their door. Despite living there for however long, next door as a neighbor, he never knocked. But he explained that, and he apologized to the community, and he said, this is so powerful. He said, if I had spent 5 minutes with you, I would not have done what I did. That's all it took, 5 minutes. He could have avoided this hate crime that could have had horrible consequences. That's the power of humanity. That's the power of the personal connection. Because we've seen this even with some very ardent anti-Muslim, pro-Trump supporters who've gone around saying horrible things against Muslims. When they actually meet Muslims, their perception changes. Because just knowing someone from a minority group is a game changer. Once you have a human face connected to a group, it's harder for people to manipulate you with false information. That personal connection can be everything. So one is to learn about Islam and meet Muslims. Number two, learn about the Islamophobia network. The $200 million plus that has been spent over a decade by 33 groups to try to spread this kind of false information and conspiracy theories and everything else. And I see the impact of that because I go around and talk to a lot of audiences, and when I get into the Q&A, when the questions all sound the same, no matter where I go and sort of what place, it's the same kind of questions, almost verbatim sometimes, that's when I know that this network has been very effective in their work. But you know what I always say? We have the truth on our side. I don't need $200 million to combat this, right? Just learning the truth, that has so much power in and of itself. So learn about that because knowledge truly is power. And then number three, look for opportunities and ways to stand together in solidarity. Like we saw this after the attacks at our mosque. When our sign was vandalized, we had an outpouring of community support. And that to me and to the entire community, the congregation, it was so powerful, so inspiring, so hope-filling, so giving us so much strength to see all of these people come out, stand up and say, no, we will not stand for that kind of behavior, that it does not represent us. We love our neighbors, and having this kind of using something bad to turning it into something positive. That kind of solidarity networks, that's one of the most beautiful things about what's happening right now. And I tell people this, I'm like, as bad as things are right now, this is an exhilarating time to be alive. This is an amazing time to be an American Muslim even. And part of that is because of all of these beautiful solidarity efforts that we're seeing. And these go both ways. It's community members with the Muslim community, it's the Muslim community with other communities. For instance, when we had the vandalizing of the Jewish cemeteries, American Muslims in our country raised over $160,000 to help restore and repair those cemeteries. This was similar to when the black churches faced a string of arson attacks, 2015, I believe, when American Muslims stepped up and raised money to restore, over $100,000 to restore those black churches. And we're seeing this kind of solidarity effort happening with so many different groups, and all of you can be a part of that. And when you're engaged in that kind of effort, that is the best way to combat despair or disillusion about what's happening sometimes in our country, some of these feelings that might otherwise take over us. And these kinds of efforts, they may not make frontline news, but they are truly manifestations of love and kindness and solidarity. And they personally humble me every single day. They inspire me and rejuvenate me. So you too can take action when you see these kinds of dangerous and destructive things happening around us, whether it's by individuals, these hate crimes, whether it's by politicians or commentators every single day in media. For example, up in Mukilteo, there was a man who sent postcards throughout the city to spread fear and opposition to the building of a mosque there. How many of you heard of that? You guys have heard of that? Okay, yeah. So this was countered. One of the most inspiring things that I saw was this being countered by that man's own sister, Wendy, who spoke out. It's actually her birthday today, so if she's listening, happy birthday, Wendy. She spoke out and showed such courage and audacity to say, this is not right. And the community used that as an opportunity to come together, unite, learn more about each other, and say, we will not stand for this in our community. So much so that that man, he actually regretted his action, and he even apologized. Sadly, his company had engaged in some horrible anti-Muslim discriminatory behavior that you may have heard of as well. It was so bad that there was a lawsuit filed by the Attorney General's office against his company, Electro Impact, and the complaint identifies sort of some of this horrible anti-Muslim behavior and discrimination that the company was engaged in. They entered into a settlement agreement now, so that's good. But when politicians and commentators, and we see this happening, like Jay Rodney, State Representative Jay Rodney, up over in Snoqualmie, he made some ugly and dangerous comments against Muslims, immigrants, and refugees. What the residents did was beautiful. They united to launch a public response through the media, and interfaith allies sent their words of support, and they used that bad incident, bad conduct by Jay Rodney to educate millions and show that attacks on any of our communities is an attack on all of us. And the Snoqualmie Mosque also held an open house, gave the community a chance to learn more about Islam and about each other and get to know their neighbors and ask questions. So it was used as a way to bring the community together and make them stronger as a result. Now, one of the most important things that you guys can do, every single one of you in this room, if you don't take anything else away from what I'm saying, this is the one action that you can take that can potentially change the hearts and minds of millions of our fellow Americans. And that is to write an op-ed or letter to the editor. Don't underestimate the power of your pen or a keyboard or voice, especially in our age of social media, especially given how much of a media problem Islamophobia is, and the over $200 million that has been spent to spread false information. You have the power to counter that with the truth. You have the power to write, letters at seattletimes.com or letters at nyt.com and speak about the lives and contributions of the American Muslims you know. Because right now, this dehumanization process is happening against American Muslims. And you have the opportunity to counter that with facts, with reality, with information about the people you know. Because I will be honest with you guys. You know, our mosque, we can do whatever we can. We'll continue doing what we can to reach out to communities, hold open houses, invite people, do what we can. But there are so many people who are not willing to even listen to somebody like me or ever visit a mosque because they're filled with so much hate and fear. But they might listen to somebody who looks like you or you. And you guys have the power and capacity to reach these other communities. And especially when you use mainstream media to do this, you have the power and capacity to reach sort of outside our typical social networks, right? A lot of times we talk to our own kind of people in our own social networks who oftentimes think like we do. But what we need to do is reach out into Middle America, for instance, and reach the millions of our fellow Americans who are so overwhelmed with the fear and hate that they will not even consider going to a mosque or learning about Muslims or meeting Muslims or anything else like that. And you have the power and capacity, a unique power and privilege, and therefore I would say responsibility to actually try to counter this. And my friends who've actually heard me say this, they're like, really? That's what it takes? And I'm like, yes. This truly is sort of this kind of media war. When this dehumanization has happened, as we've seen in our country, we know what happens when that dehumanization process occurs from our nation's history, from other countries' history. We've seen some of the darkest chapters in world history happen as a result of the dehumanization. And that dehumanization is in place right now, and you guys all have the power to stop that, to push it back, to humanize, to personalize the American Muslims that you know. That truly is one of the most powerful weapons, tools that you guys have to promote peace and unity and help humanize American Muslims for our fellow Americans by speaking about the lives and contributions of the Muslims that you know. And that can help stop the spread of the dehumanization process, the demonization process, and perhaps even change hearts and minds of our fellow Americans. And even if it doesn't get published, you could be changing the hearts and minds of the publishers, the editors who read that, who recognize that, hey, people are speaking out. What we're saying and doing in mainstream media is not right. So there is potential there to make true change. And at the end of the day, the most important thing for you is to be active and vocal and loud. Because right now is our time to do exactly that. And most of you, like I said, are in a position of privilege and power, especially when it comes to this issue. So what you say and what you do, and importantly, what you don't say or what you don't do, can have a huge, huge impact. So please do something. Because as Martin Luther King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So, sorry, a little choked up there. So please don't be silent. Please use the power that you have. Don't take for granted the power and opportunity that you have to make a real difference. And with that, I'll go ahead and sort of use some time for Q&A. And I will say that in my Q&A, I like to make it very clear. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there about Islam and Muslims, and I welcome real questions. I want us to have a safe, honest space for you to feel comfortable asking anything. Ask me the hard questions. Don't worry about offending me. I'd rather you ask me as a Muslim, a practicing Muslim, than somebody else, or getting information from Google or wherever else. So please feel free to ask any question. It could be about what I spoke about, Islamophobia. It could be about Islam generally. It could be about anything. I'm an open book. I do not get offended easily, and I really, really welcome you to ask anything that's on your mind. And if you're worried about offending me, you could frame it as I've heard or others have said, or any other way so that you recognize that. And if you really don't feel comfortable, you could write it down and maybe somebody could bring me a written question as well. So can we have a mic? Yeah, that might help. Oh,
I'm going to speak really loud.
okay.
Hi.
Hello.
I am a realtor, and I have only met one other person that would say that he is a believer in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
I love him to death, but he's not a girl, and so I've never been able to, I've never met, isn't that terrible, everybody?
You're not alone.
I don't know people.
It's okay.
Okay, with that, why are you wearing a headdress but not a burqa?
Okay, great question. So first off, thank you for admitting, that you don't know other American Muslim women. I appreciate that, and you're not unique. There are a lot of people, like I said, over 60% of our fellow Americans have never met any Muslim in our country. So that is not a shocking statistic to me in any way. The question specifically is, why am I wearing a head covering but not a burqa? So a burqa, for those who may not know, is sort of a full body covering that is worn, oftentimes covering the face as well, and just the eyes showing. That's what a burqa is. And the reality is that the Quran or Islam does not prescribe specific attire. What it prescribes is modesty. It commands modesty. And modesty varies, and the specific attire that you see is based on different cultural practices. So different places, different regions, you will see people, both men and women, dressed differently depending on what the cultural norms are in that location. I myself started wearing the hijab, the head covering, about less than 3 years ago. Before that, I was not wearing the head covering, and many other people in my family, other women, do not wear the head covering. It is a personal choice that every Muslim makes for themselves and decides if they want to wear it or not. And I made the choice personally, and I have to say this, it wasn't that I thought that the Quran commands a head covering. In fact, what the Quran says is, back in the days, they would wear these head coverings, these veils, but they would have it back sort of with the veil hanging behind them, and they would have their breasts exposed, or cleavage showing, I should say. So the commandment in the Quran is, women who believe, pull your head coverings over your bosom. So the command is to cover the cleavage specifically. And then some people say that assumes you're wearing a head covering, so you're supposed to wear a head covering. There's difference of interpretation on that. The reality is that the Bible actually is more explicit in women wearing head coverings than the Quran is, if you compare the verses. And oftentimes what I see people doing is evaluating Islam's prescription for modesty, and specifically the head covering, wearing of the head covering, evaluating that through the perspective or through the lens of the Bible, where the description given in the Bible in 1 Corinthians, I forgot where exactly, 1 Corinthians 10, I want to say. But in any case, the description in the Bible presents it as, women are doing this because they are in some way, I don't want to say it in a bad way, but it comes off a little bit inferior to men in the biblical verse. That's not what it says in the Quran. The Quran just says, you who believe, pull that over your bosoms. And in fact, the command to the believers first about modesty is first to men. And it tells men, lower your gaze. And the command is both to men and women. Lower your gaze, that is better for you. So it tells men to do that, and modesty is prescribed. The hijab, the concept of modesty, is prescribed for men in Islam as well. And then for women, it comes down and says that specifically. And it's up to each individual Muslim to choose what they want to wear and how they want to wear it, but the commandment from God is modesty. And that has different manifestations in different cultures, and in different places you will see different things. And when I say for people, is for instance in Saudi Arabia, when you see what the men and women wear, their clothing is very similar, because it came out of living in sort of the desert and the desert lands, and you want to cover your face because you don't want desert storms and sand getting in your eyes and things like that. So it's very different from a place like America, where the concept of modesty may play out differently. And it's also what is sort of people around you doing. Modesty can be relative as well. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah. There's a question over there?
Yeah, it works. Yeah, thank you.
One of the things I hear commonly from people who are kind of trying to legitimize Islamophobia is and forgive me, I don't know the specifics, but it's that Muhammad supposedly told his followers to kill all the infidels. Mm-hmm. And so that's where they get this idea that, the religion, the ISIS may be extreme, but the religion is like, Muhammad said to kill the infidels. So if somebody did say that to me, what would I specifically say back that would address that?
Yeah. Great question. And this is certainly one of the points that is repeated oftentimes in even mainstream media sometimes, but certainly by commentators left and right, actually, because we have the far left and the far right are sort of attacking Islam in different ways at different times. But that is a very valid question. And that question, what I do is I give people sort of context for what we're talking about here. Because as I gave that biblical verse quoting Jesus, you can see how you can take a verse out of the Bible completely out of context, and that's what happens with the verses from the Quran. So let me just give that context for what is, and tell you specifically what he said and what he taught and what the Quran says. So the Quran came down over the course of 23 years. And the first 13 years was in Mecca and then 10 years in Medina. And for the whole time in Mecca that the Muslims were there, that Prophet Muhammad was getting revelation and the Muslim community was building there, they were never given permission to fight, not even self-defense. And they were being attacked, tortured, persecuted, and even killed. And their homes were being taken, their property was being taken, to the point it got so bad that they had to flee Mecca and escape to Medina. And they did not even have the right to fight in self-defense at that time. And when they asked Prophet Muhammad, they're like, please let us fight in self-defense. He's like, I was not sent to allow for killing. I was not sent to allow this kind of thing. And you have to understand that we Muslims believe in all the prophets. So the teachings of Jesus, peace be upon him, for instance, is similar to what Prophet Muhammad also taught us. So he came and he specifically was sent, as he said, as a mercy to mankind, not as a source of violence or hurting or anything else like that. This is why they fled Mecca and went to Medina. In Medina, if this was truly sort of what his teaching was, the sort of violence, which is completely false, they would have attacked there, but they didn't. He built a community. The first constitution, written constitution, was there in Medina under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad. And there were Jewish tribes there were Arab tribes, there were non-practicing tribes there. He brought the whole community together under one banner, one constitution, one community. This sense of one community, despite differences, was established there. And they lived in relative peace with certain exceptions of different things that came up. But even when they went to Medina, the Meccans and others did not leave them alone. They continued attacking them. And it was 2 years into their time in Medina when finally the verse came down, allowing the Muslims at that time to fight in self-defense. That was the first time the commandment had been given, that they were given permission to defend themselves using physical force. Because before, the whole concept of jihad, of inner struggle, because that's truly what it means, it's not physical fighting, it's inner struggle. That jihad was that they had to hold back, they had to restrain themselves. But 2 years into Medina, they were given permission to protect themselves, to fight in self-defense. And that's when they started. So this war was going on. Then finally, they enter into a peace treaty with the Meccans. And this is something that the Muslims had been wanting to get for a long time. They finally get this peace treaty, a 10-year peace treaty. But guess what? The Meccans, 2 years into that, broke their treaty. They broke the peace treaty. That's why, but in the meantime, while they had that peace treaty, Prophet Muhammad was able to share and spread his message about Islam, about unity, about peace, about love, about one God, about bringing us all together, a shared common humanity. He was able to do that. So he actually had increased his numbers. So when the Meccans broke the peace treaty, he then was able to get a fort 10,000 men strong and march into Mecca. Now the Meccans at that point, they thought they were toast. They knew that the force was a lot bigger than they could fight. But not only that, they knew what happened back then. They knew what happened with the conquering forces. They would often slaughter or take as prisoner any community that they take over, right? Prophet Muhammad, he didn't go in as a victor, even though he was clearly victorious at that time in the conquest of Mecca. It was a bloodless conquest. He marched in 3 columns, and when he went in, even as a victor, he had his head down on his horse, and the whole time he was begging forgiveness of God. He showed a kind of humility, and when he met the Meccans, he told them, what do you think I'm going to do? And you know what he said to them too? He quoted to them the very same words that Prophet Joseph said, peace be upon him, in forgiving his brothers who had deceived and betrayed him, and so left him in a well. He repeated those words to the Meccans. And I'm going to not say it exactly, but it's something along the lines of, no harm to you this day, you are forgiven. May God forgive you. Those were his words to his fellow Meccans. And you have to understand, some of these people had killed Muhammad's own family members, including one woman, Hind, who had ordered a hitman, basically, to kill Prophet Muhammad's uncle. And that wasn't enough for her. She was so enraged that after Prophet Muhammad's uncle was killed, she went on the battlefield to the body of Prophet Muhammad's uncle, tore out certain of his body parts and ate it in front of everybody, just to show dominance that she had over him. This is Hind. And Prophet Muhammad spoke with her and forgave her and accepted her in Islam. Just to give you his act of mercy, it is profound. It is one of the greatest manifestations of mercy in human history. And that's why the majority of the Meccans became Muslim, just witnessing that act of tremendous mercy. So then what about this verse? What happened then a commandment came down from God. At that time, after this conquest of Mecca, the commandment came down saying, basically, and it's directed to these, infidels isn't the right word. The proper word would be to these people who were engaging in warfare. And it's not like non-believers, like non-Muslims. In fact, Christians and Jews are recognized as people of the book in the Quran. They are not even labeled infidels. But it's talking about these Meccans who were engaged in continuing to fight, because a lot of them accepted Islam. A lot of them said, okay, we're not fighting anymore. But there were some who said, no, they're going to continue fighting. So the commandment came down in the Quran to Prophet Muhammad saying, look, tell these people that they have 4 months, this period of immunity, 4 months. During those 4 months, they can leave Mecca if they choose to. They can stay and accept Islam if they choose to. They can stay and not accept Islam but not fight you if they choose to. If they don't know about Islam and they want to learn about it, go teach them. Give them the opportunity and the chance for them to choose if they want to accept this or not. But if they reject all of those and they decide they want to continue fighting them, then you go kill them wherever you find them, because they would hide out. That's the context in which that commandment came down. It gave permission to fight the people who were fighting Islam and the Muslims at that time. And when you look at God's judgments sort of from a more religious perspective throughout the Bible, throughout history, like when the people of Noah were being drowned, with the flood, or when the people that Moses was facing, Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, when their punishment came from God, there was no pause button. There was no opportunity for them to repent. And this, at that point, that conquest of Mecca, that was God's judgment, because that place, Mecca, was a holy place. That house of God, the cube that you guys see in pictures, that was actually built by Prophet Abraham and Prophet Ishmael, his son, peace be upon them both. That was a place that God had ordained that this is a religious site. It was a house of worshiping God. It's going to return to being a house of worshiping God. That's why the idols were destroyed in that house upon the conquest of Mecca. But God gave people 4 months. And he even said, if there's somebody basically, because this is specifically in the Quran, what if somebody comes to you, Prophet Muhammad, and says, look, I don't know what these people have been doing. I don't know what was going on. I've never heard of Islam. What is this? All I know is you came into my city and now you're in control. What about me? Don't I get a chance? And the Quran specifically says, if that kind of person comes to you, you take them to a safe place. You teach them, tell them what Islam is. Give them the choice. If they accept Islam, great. They're your sister or brother. If they refuse to accept Islam, that's fine too. It's their choice. That's the whole test of life is faith. The whole test of faith is choice. You have to be able to choose your religious conviction. And if they choose to leave, you have to escort them out peacefully and safely out of the city if they choose that. But again, if they stay and fight you, then you are given permission to fight them and kill them where you find them. Because Islam had been teaching peace and nonviolence for so long that the people needed that explicit command to be able to engage in that kind of warfare, especially in the holy city, in the area around the house of worship, because that was a sanctity city. It was that permission that was given for that venue, that location, at that time, for the people who had been fighting the Muslims for years, attacking them, persecuting them, torturing them. Those were the people it's talking about. And it has no sort of meaning about attacking Christians or Jews or anything else like that, because they are entirely a different category in the Quran. They are treated with respect and talked about as the learned people, people of the book. They were given prophets and revelation beforehand. And as Muslims in Islam, we accept all those prophets, from Adam, to Moses, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jesus, peace be upon all of them. We accept all of them. And we also accept all the revelation that was given to the prior prophets. So that's the context in which, and when you take it out of context, very easy to create a different sort of conspiracy theory about, oh, Muslims are scary, they're out to get us, and they're going to kill us all. Absolutely not. It was, in fact, the opposite of that. It was a tremendous showing of mercy that cannot be paralleled by sort of most instances in human history, the amount of mercy that was shown there. I hope that answers.